Thank you so much for choosing to take my class, Gold Rush, the Rustic Crackle Technique. Part 1 of this class will take you from conditioning to baking of your beads. We're going to learn how to make a crackle sheet in polymer, form organic beads, combine the two, and then bake them. Here's the material list for part 1 of this class. As you'll see, it's a lot of basic polymer working tools. Some of the things you might not normally use are a heat gun and the sanding pad, but you'll definitely need all the things on this list. So let's get started. I always start by conditioning my clay. It might not be the most fun part of the project, but it's very important. I like to slice it into pieces about a ½ inch or less, run it through the pasta machine. I use the thickest setting and run a few pieces through and then combine 3 of them, run them through again, fold them in half, run them through again, and I do this over and over until it's smooth, pliable, and thoroughly mixed. Now we're going to create the sheet that is going to become your gold crackle. So what you want to do is grab a couple of pieces of the polymer that you've just conditioned, put them on top of each other, and once again run them through the pasta machine. Keep it on the thickest setting. I usually run them through 3 or 4 times, folding them lengthwise and horizontally until I get a sheet of clay that looks sort of like a rectangle. It's going to be a rectangle with jagged edges like you see in the picture there, and that's fine. Just make sure that when you run the final sheet through, you want to have as much clay as possible that fits through your machine, and you want it to be on the thickest setting possible. Now you want to take that sheet and you want to fold it in half. What you're doing is now you're making this double the thickness of the thickest setting on your pasta machine. Take your roller and just lightly roll it. You don't want to take any of the thickness off of it, but you just want to press it together to get rid of air bubbles and just firm it up. You'll see you're left with a piece with jagged edges, and this is fine. You can work with this, but if that bothers you and you like to work with a neater sheet, you can just take a tissue blade and trim off those rough edges. And again, you want to try to keep the biggest piece of sheet possible. Next, we're going to use the Inca Gold to coat our little sheet of polymer clay that we've made. It's nice to use Inca Gold that is still fresh and soft. It can dry out over time. As you can see here, this is nice and gooey, and I've got a nice glob on my finger. You're going to take that and you're going to smear it all over the surface of your sheet. You don't want it so thin that you're seeing white through. You want a nice thick coat on it, but you also don't want too many globs on there as well. Try to smooth it out with a nice thick coat. Inca Gold cleans up really nice and wipes easily off your finger with a dry paper towel. For this next step, we'll be using a heat gun. The goal in this step is to dry and partially cure the polymer clay on the top layer. This is what's going to give us that special kind of crackle. You want to hold the heat gun about 2 inches from the surface, moving it around constantly as it's on. The amount of time that you do this is what's going to greatly vary the results, and that's a good thing. I actually downloaded an app on my phone to help me time it so that I could track the length of time that I cure it and then see what kind of crackle that gives me. And you're going to get to see those different results in just a few minutes. After curing your piece for about 1 to 1.5 minutes, that's a good place to start. You may need to use a tissue blade to remove it from your tile. What we're going to do then is run it through the pasta machine on the largest, the thickest setting. What this is going to do is this is going to cause the crackle on the piece. It's going to spread the piece thinner, causing that cured, dried Inca gold on the surface to spread apart. And then the thickness, the gooey underside that isn't cured yet, is what's going to kind of hold it together in a sheet. Now, depending on how long you are using the heat gun, as we go a little bit longer to make different kinds of crackles, it'll be crumblier. So I always put a little something under my pasta machine to catch the crumbs and the little broken pieces. For mine, a little top of a cardboard jewelry box fits perfect, and that's what I use. This is a sheet that was heated for about 45 seconds to a minute. If you notice, it's got a very smooth finish. It's a very classic crackle for this kind of technique. In order to get a really fine crackle, you want to run your sheet through the pasta machine again in the opposite direction. First, set it for one size thinner and then turn it sideways and run it through again. If your sheet is too wide, you may need to take a tissue blade to cut it into smaller sections and run both sheets through. That's fine. This is essentially how we make the crackle sheet. Now I'm going to walk you through what these sheets look like if you cure them for different amounts of times with the heat gun, and just talk a little bit more about that process. I really encourage you to make a variety of sheets for this. Here's an example of a sheet that has been cured for 1.5 minutes. This was run through one direction on the pasta machine on the biggest setting, and you can see that the crumbles and crackles are much bigger in nature. They're also more three-dimensional and raised because that top layer of polymer clay has been cured, but that bottom layer is still soft and spongy. So that bottom layer holds it together while these top pieces are kind of hard and crumbly. And now we're getting to the kind of look that we're going for in this project. I've now turned this sheet and run it through on a smaller setting in the opposite direction, and now you can see what the crackle looks like. Now it's broken into smaller pieces. It's nice and crumbly. I did a close up here. You can see how it's kind of raised. Those are the pieces that are more cured crumbling, and then they're sticking to that softer backing. This shows you a piece that was cured even longer, and you can see when you run it through the pasta machine that it might even fall apart, and you might feel like this is completely unusable. I really encourage you to do a lot of sheets for this project, cure them at all different times, and save all the pieces. You're going to see how we're going to put these together, and you're going to be able to use all these different pieces. When you have a piece that is this cured and this crumbly, you might not be able to turn it and run it through the pasta machine again. It might be in too many pieces. You can take your hand roller and try to roll it out in the other direction. It's a little harder, and you can see in the second picture that you do get some crackles that way. You can also take your fingernail and push down on it and break pieces apart to give you more crackle. Here's yet another example of curing even longer. This one was over 2 minutes that I cured it with the heat gun, and you can see it is absolutely just a pile of crumbly hard polymer. But save it because you're going to use this and it's going to give you the greatest effects down the road. So after I'm done this sheet making marathon, I take all my different crackles. You can see here I've just shown an example of a few different ones that I'll be using, and I save them all, and we're going to use them in the next stage. Now we're going to form some organic shaped beads. The first thing you need to know about making beads feel natural and organic is to never use shape cutters for them. You don't see perfect shapes often in nature, especially when it comes to stones and things like we're mimicking. So to make a donut focal, I roll out a ball. The size of the ball determines the size of your donut. I like to go big. This is probably almost a half of a block of 2-ounce clay. Then I will roll one side of it a little flatter to taper it. Now you want to slightly flatten your donut piece using your roller. You don't want to go too thin here, especially if you're going bigger. You just want the piece to feel as substantial as it looks. So you don't want a really wide piece that's really thin. Plus, we're going to be adding crackle in and you need to have some place for it to sink. So I recommend your pieces be at least a 1/2 inch thick. I then use a needle tool to make the hole. Using a needle tool allows you to make the hole any size and any shape you want. Again, grabbing that kind of organic, natural feel that we're trying to get here with these pieces. Next, I smooth the rough edges made by using the needle tool. I just use my fingers to smooth them out. And since we're going to be painting these pieces, you don't have to worry about fingerprints. How awesome is that? That's one of my favorite parts about painting pieces. Here I'm just showing you what it looks like if you make your center hole with a hole cutter. I do like the look of a nice organic shape all the way around, but sometimes having a nice round center hole actually puts the focus on your organically shaped outer silhouette. So either way is fine. It's totally up to you. You can do mixtures of both. I just wanted to show you the difference in look between cutting out with a needle tool and using an actual hole cutter for the center hole. To complete this project, you're also going to need an accent bead to go with your focal donut. So you want to do the same thing you did to form the donut, just a little smaller. So you want to roll a ball, taper one side, roll it flat. Again, you want to keep it thick, at least a 1/2 inch. Then you want to make a hole through this bead. You can use a needle tool, you can use a skewer. I have really fallen in love with the Etch and Pearl tool. It's by Polyform Products and it's tapered. So I start my hole from one side, I go all the way through, then I flip it and I come through from the other direction. And because it's tapered, it actually smooths the edges of the hole, so there's no cleanup for you. You don't have to smooth any part of it. So it's really nice. When you're making your hole in your accent bead, you want to keep in mind how it's going to hang. So if you want the narrower part of your bead to be facing down, you need to make your hole above the center mark in that widest part of the bead. Otherwise, the heaviness of that wide top part will flip around on your finished project. I always encourage my students to go ahead and make multiples, especially when it's your first time doing something. So once you have some focal beads to choose from and some accent beads to choose from, now it's time to get ready to combine the crackle with your bead. So you want to get your crackle sheets that you had made laid out. Maybe pick a couple different size crackles and just put them right on your tile with your bead that you want to work on. I like to prepare my workspace by tearing little strips off of the sheets and laying them around my bead. You just tear it like you would paper. You just grab a little piece and it should peel really nicely. And it doesn't have to be even. Uneven is great. Again, we're going for that natural organic look, so you want that variety in shape. Now you're ready to put the crackle onto the bead. I use Bacon Bond. I just like to be really thorough and know that this is really going to stick. You can either apply it to the back of the crackle pieces, or I often just smear it across the surface of the bead where I'm going to be pressing this in. You're going to take a strip of your crackle and just press it lightly onto the bead. When you're applying your gold crackle, I like to either fold the edges over, you want it to be smooth with the side of your bead, or you can trim them off with a needle tool. Then when you have that strip looking nice, and it doesn't have to be flattened, you can add a little more Bacon Bond, and you're going to take more little strips or bits and pieces. I like to vary the size, so this is when you can pull from your larger, crumblier pieces and break little bits off and stick them in. Once you have your mosaic of gold pieces laid out, how you like them on your bead, you can take your ruler and just slightly flatten it. You don't want them sunk really far into the piece, but you do want them sunk in a little bit. You definitely want to see that raised texture so it ends up looking like a gold vein running through a stone. To give it some stone texture, I love these sanding pads. You can get them at the hardware store. I use them for sanding later in the project, but I also use them for texture. And I like to just take the straight edge, the real thin flat edge, and I just press it on either side of the vein that I've made, and it gives it a nice transition from the crackle to some texture to the smooth clay. So here's what the bead looks like close up with all the different sizes and pieces of gold applied. It's been rolled, it's been given that stone-like texture which you can lightly see here and there. You don't want to over texture it with that sanding pad because when we paint it, those little textures in the surface are going to grab on to some dark paint and it's going to look really dirty, which is great. You can, if that's what you're going for, but sometimes it can really tone down the colors too much. So here and there is what I tell people. Around the gold crackle, maybe just a dab up at the top, and then it's going to give you a very good stone look. Now you want to apply the crackle to your accent bead. You can either do it the same way we just did the donut by applying your Bacon Bond, pressing your crackle pieces in, and then rolling it a little bit more to set them in. You can do this on both sides. Or I want to show you another way that you can do it. I like to give you a couple different ways to do things. Everybody has a different way that they like to do things, and hopefully you'll find one that works better for you. So this other way to do accent beads, especially if you're going to do rounded or different shapes, this is a great way to do it. So what I do is I actually roll the ball of clay to form the bead, like I haven't made the bead yet, and then I put a strip of Bacon Bond around it, and then I apply the crackle. So you're seeing that in the first picture. In the second picture, I've now rolled the ball to set that crackle in a little bit, tapered the one end like we did to give it that organic shape, and rolled it kind of flat. And it shapes your bead and it sets the crackle in at the same time. Then you're going to, once again, make your hole in your bead just like we did before. Now it's time to bake. Bake the clay according to the manufacturer's instructions. Don't forget to account for time that it takes to preheat your oven. You need to make sure that it hits that target temperature for the correct amount of time. Using a good oven thermometer can help you to ensure that. Sometimes it needs to be in for an hour just to hit that 20 minutes of the correct temperature. I also want to tell you about using pizza stones in baking. I love them. I prefer them and I highly recommend them. They never overheat. They also never give you those shiny spots or hot spots that cooking on metal does. Even if you bake on glass, which tends to be a little bit of a more even temperature, it can give you shiny spots and shiny sides. I never have this, so it allows me to have very unified beads. It also doesn't give me flat spots on my round beads. I cook round beads on these all the time and I don't get flat spots because they just heat so evenly. So I highly recommend them. They're wonderful. Once your beads are cured and cooled, now you want to take your sanding pad and you just want to use it to smooth out any rough spots. Sometimes when you use these more cured chunky pieces of gold, little edges sticking up will be rough, and that's not going to be good for something that you want to wear. I will usually run my finger over the beads, check for these spots that need to be sanded, and then I will just sand that specific area. You don't want to sand off your gold, and you might on the edges a little bit in the process of smoothing them, and that's fine, but you don't want to sand hard over top of the gold pieces or you will sand that gold right off, and then all your hard work just went down the tube. That wraps up part one of our class. Make sure to stay tuned for part two, where we will learn how to paint these beads in a manner that's going to make them look earthy and natural.